A stunning development at the OJ Simpson trial. The jury has reached a verdict.
Ladies and gentlemen, while we were taking our brief recess, Mrs. Robertson advised me that you buzzed 3 times and indicated that after receiving the verdict forms that you have reached a verdict in this case. Is that correct, Madam Foreman? Yes. All right. Then if everything is appropriate, then we'll accept the verdicts from you tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. You've heard about as much as we know. No one, absolutely no one, would have predicted it. After a trial that has lasted 3/4 of a year, the jury in the OJ Simpson trial has taken less than 4 hours to reach a verdict. And as you heard the judge say there, we will not know precisely what it is until tomorrow morning. But to give you the ambiance, the flavor, and what we do know, we go to Los Angeles, and first ABC's Aaron Brown.
Good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen.
After a half a day of deliberations, the jury told the judge it had reached a verdict.
Mrs. Robertson advised me that you buzzed 3 times and indicated that after receiving the verdict forms that you have reached a verdict in this case. Is that correct, Madam Foreman?
But because all the lawyers were not present, the judge will hold the verdict until tomorrow morning.
And I indicated to the attorneys that I would give them a reasonable opportunity to be here for the announcement of the verdict. And I've indicated to them that I will accept the verdict from you tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock.
The jury reached its verdict after having heard just a small part of the testimony of limousine driver Alan Park, that he didn't see the Bronco when he arrived at Rockingham.
Did you see any car, white Bronco, parked to the left of the gate as you faced it? Answer, no, I didn't.
That no one answered the intercom.
And there is an intercom at the gate, and I was using that intercom to buzz the house. And I buzzed it, and there was no answer.
And that no lights were on downstairs when he arrived.
Question, could you see any lights on downstairs? Answer, no, I couldn't.
They did not want to hear the part where Park says he saw someone resembling Simpson walking into the house just before 11. The news of the quick verdict left prosecutors looking tense. Simpson seemed to look relaxed. The verdict, whatever it is, will be announced at 10 o'clock Pacific time tomorrow. Aaron Brown, ABC News, Los Angeles.
10 o'clock Pacific time is just after noon, 1 o'clock Eastern time, and of course we shall be on the air for that. Want to be joined now by our legal affairs correspondent, Cynthia McFadden, who's in our Los Angeles bureau. Cynthia, this caught everybody off base, but when the judge said at one point he wanted to give the attorneys time to gather, did he not, do I recall, also want law enforcement to have a fair warning that the verdict was coming down?
I think so, Peter. I also think that he wanted to give the families involved, the Simpson family, the Goldman family, and the Brown family, a chance to be in court if they choose to do so tomorrow. The families at one point had asked for a 24-hour notice. The judge has, of course, given overnight. The Simpson family, I know, has returned to San Francisco and believe that they are now making their way back to Los Angeles for the verdict tomorrow morning.
Okay, we've all agreed that we're not going to speculate at all on this broadcast about what the jury might actually be doing, but tell us what we do know precisely about this jury and the rapidity with which they moved.
Well, Peter, it is unusual, especially when murder in the first degree is a charge, to have a jury come back this quickly. We know, first of all, that all the smarties were wrong. Everyone who said these jurors, including myself, who said these jurors would be out some amount of time, that they seemed, that we believed they would be deadlocked and take a considerable amount of time to reach a judgment. We were all wrong because we know at this point the forms have been filled out, which means that they could not be coming back with a hung jury. Judge Ito asked if the forms were filled out, and that means that they have chosen either guilty or not guilty on the verdict forms.
Okay, Cynthia, stay with me for just 1 second, but just so people have a quick grasp of what guilty and not guilty implications are for Mr. Simpson, here's a little bit of background on what a guilty verdict would mean and what a not guilty verdict would mean. If the jury unanimously finds Simpson not guilty, he will walk out of Judge Ito's courtroom a free man. But life will never be the same again, and he has already talked to his jailers about how best to ensure his privacy. The judge has told the jury that it can find Simpson guilty of first or second-degree murder for either or both of the killings. Under California law, the lightest sentence he could receive is 16 years to life in prison, with the possibility of parole in slightly less than 11 years. The maximum would be life without the possibility of parole.
California, life in prison without parole means life in prison without parole. That's not a code term for he gets paroled someday. It actually means that.
It means that after sentencing, Simpson would be transferred from the Los Angeles County Jail to one of 11 prisons in the state reserved for the most violent offenders. With Simpson...
What happened to that?
You know, obviously these jurors were way ahead of everybody. They've made up their minds, and if it is a conviction, it's really, you know, the facts and not the rhetoric that won out.
Thank you all very much. Now, we're doing this as a live broadcast. We're certainly going to have more about the Simpson case and the impending verdict later in the broadcast, but coming up next...
By everybody, that all of the various races and sexes, I was going to say, I guess there are only 2 sexes on the jury, all went to her, that she was a peacemaker on this jury, and she indeed was chosen as the foreperson. We know that they came to their conclusion, Peter, in under 3 hours of deliberations. We know that today is the 265th day of their sequestration. The judge, as he let them go tonight, said, "Have your last pleasant evening." Finally, this will be coming to an end.
Okay, Cynthia, thank you very much. May not necessarily be coming to an end, but it's certainly going to be coming to an end in this particular phase of it. And just to remind you that our coverage of the verdict will begin at 12:30 p.m. tomorrow Eastern, at 9:30 in the morning in Los Angeles, and we hope you will join us as you have in the past. We'll have a little more about this, and of course we'll have all the other news of the day when we come back.
This is...
Joining me once again, as they have throughout this trial, you can see Jack Ford and Ira Reiner at the top of your screen. At the bottom of the screen on the left is Paul Lisnick, an expert on juries, and Roy Black, an expert in his own way. He's a well-known criminal lawyer from Miami. Let's begin with you, Jack Ford. Swift decision, and they asked only to rehear the testimony of the one man who had no investment in this case, as it were, Alan Park, the limousine driver. What does that mean?
If you're the prosecutors, you're looking at this saying, this might be a real good sign for us. As you heard before, Marcia Clark had said in her comments to the jurors that Alan Park is the defining moment in this trial because he was the one witness who was not refuted by anybody and established for the prosecution that O.J. Simpson was not at home during the period of time that the murders were taking place. You know, traditional wisdom is a quick verdict is a prosecution verdict. Some people were looking at this case saying a quick verdict may well be a defense verdict. I don't know really that anybody can say what it means, but if you try to read into what the jurors were doing, and it's not always accurate at all, oftentimes speculation. If you try to read into what the jurors did here, where they listened to just a portion of Alan Park's testimony, might suggest that you're talking about a guilty verdict, but again, truly, we don't know.
Well, Ira, lots of lawyers, journalists, and defendants have ended up with egg on their face trying to second-guess juries. What's your best call tonight?
Well, you throw everything out the window. All bets are off. You know, if words have any meaning, there were no deliberations in this case. When the jurors retired to the jury room to allegedly deliberate, they had already made up their mind. The only question is, what was their decision? Because they didn't deliberate on it. And who carried the day? Was it Johnny Cochran, who urged the jurors to, excuse me, use their verdict to send a message that the police were corrupt? And as Johnny Cochran said, the only way that you can clean up the police is to acquit Simpson. Did that message carry the day, or was it Chris Darden who said to the jurors, each and every one of them, you know he did it. Everybody knows he did it.
What?
Well, one of those two messages got through because they didn't have to discuss it among themselves. They just went in and they were ready to vote.
Roy Black, if you were sitting on the defense side of that courtroom, would you be unsettled by the fact that they only asked to hear the testimony once again, the one man who said O.J. Simpson did not appear to be at home during the crucial hours?
Tom, the reason no one's going to be sleeping tonight is because while they asked for Alan Park's testimony, they virtually had no deliberations, as Ira said, and usually a short deliberation means that it's a verdict of not guilty. However, reading Park's testimony and only the direct examination sounds dangerous to the defense. So it's anybody's guess, and this has more twists and turns than any mystery I've ever heard of.
And Paul Lisnick, you're an expert on the arcane science of selecting a jury and then trying to read how they may respond to a case. Were you as stunned as everyone else by the shortness of this deliberation?
Absolutely, Tom. I didn't expect them to deliberate for very, very long, but 5.5 hours pulls up short. I agree with pretty much what Ira and Roy are saying, that this jury went in with its mind made up. And that concerns me, because that suggests where there's some discussion, some things that shouldn't have been going on before they entered that deliberation room.
All right, let's go quickly around the horn if we can. If you want to put yourselves on the record, beginning with you, Jack. Guilty, not guilty, hung jury.
Tom, we know it's at this juncture one of those two, as you said, guilty, not guilty. And truly, as we've all said, nothing would surprise me in this case. I don't have any ability to project what it's going to be. Whatever they say tomorrow will not be a surprise.
Maybe we can save some time here. I gather Ira and Roy and Paul, you would probably take the same stance.
No, I wouldn't, Tom. Let me tell you this. I'm willing to go out on a limb.
Okay.
With 5 hours worth of deliberations, I think that it has to be not guilty.
All right, well, we'll have a chance to check.
I would agree.
Okay.
I would agree. It's
Ira says not guilty. Paul?
I think we may see a conviction, given Alan Park's testimony and the focus on that. I'm surprised.
We'll have a chance to check all of that tomorrow, obviously. We'll be back with more news right after this.
Also mentioned the coming visit of Pope John Paul and the current visit of Egyptian President Mubarak. In front of the White House today, even pedestrians were barred from Pennsylvania Avenue. And in New York, security heightened at tunnels and bridges, police checking some trucks for contents. But the steps were most noticeable at airports, where the government has 4 levels of security. Last August, level 2 was ordered. Now it's to be level 3 by Wednesday at latest. But that's still not as high as level 4, instituted during the Persian Gulf War.
No word how long the new security will remain in effect, but airlines hope it can be reached. Robert Hager, NBC News, Washington.
And there's another hurricane to keep an eye on during this busy storm season. This one is called Opal. It could threaten the U.S. later this week. Opal is sitting in the Gulf of Mexico tonight, dumping heavy rains and forcing thousands from their homes in Mexico. The storm is expected to turn north, and it could threaten the U.S. Gulf Coast. On Wall Street, the Dow was down today in heavy trading. The NASDAQ was down as well. When we come back, NBC News in depth tonight. A big stride in the race for a cure for cancer, a $100 million gift from a man.
13 on your Bluegrass Cellular telephone.
Tennis, the women, they beat Cumberland today 7-2. They are 2-0 in the fall. And Greenwood's girls soccer team, they beat White House, Tennessee 6-1. They improved to 7-6.
All right, quick programming note. The verdict tomorrow at noon Central Time. ABC News coverage will begin at 11:30. Immediately following midday, we'll of course have local reaction and lots of coverage tomorrow on midday. News Center 13 live at 5, 6, and 10. The OJ trial, of course, is the topic of Nightline, which is coming up next, and it's a special edition. Have a nice evening. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
Good night. Good night.
October 2nd, 1995.
Good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen.
After nearly a year of testimony, a decision is reached in less than 3 hours.
Mrs. Robertson advised me that you buzzed 3 times and indicated that after receiving the verdict forms that you have reached a verdict in this case. Is that correct, Madam Foreman?
Yes.
But with the lead lawyers out of the courtroom, the announcement is postponed until tomorrow, unleashing a whirlwind of speculation.
It would be extraordinary to have a guilty verdict returned this quickly. If I were the defense, I would be very concerned at this point.
With 5 hours worth of deliberations, I think that it has to be not guilty.
This guy has gone down, and he's convicted.
And keeping the jury away from home for one more night.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, then have your last pleasant weekend evening, and we'll see you tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock.
Tonight, the state versus OJ Simpson, waiting for the verdict.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
Some of the experts, of course, will turn out to have been right, which will only enhance their status as experts. For the record, though, the experts as a group are all over the lot tonight. A quick verdict tends to favor the defense. Most of the experts noted that at one point or another today. The jury didn't look at the defendant, though, and that, say the experts, is usually a bad sign for the defense. Anyway, the only piece of evidence the jury wanted to hear again was testimony that is regarded as bolstering the prosecution's case. That points to a guilty verdict. Still, several of the jurors were smiling, and that hints that the verdict will be not guilty. Whichever way it goes, however, there is some reason to believe that the jury may have disregarded the judge's instructions. Remember, session after session would be wrapped up with Judge Ito reminding the jury not to discuss the case among themselves, not to reach any conclusions. That may have been precisely what they did, but it's a little hard to understand how 12 undecided men and women who had never previously discussed the case were able to get it all done without asking to see any of the evidence and revisiting only one piece of testimony. After less than 3 hours, Judy Mullo reports, Judge Ito said this.
Mrs. Robertson advised me that you buzzed 3 times and indicated that after receiving the verdict forms that you have reached a verdict in this case. Is that correct, Madam Foreman? Yes. All right.
Perhaps no one was more stunned by this development than O.J. Simpson and the one lawyer with him in court today, Carl Douglas. The jury had reached its verdict in a matter of hours, but it would be another 19 hours before the world and the defendant would hear what that verdict is.
I indicated to the attorneys that I would give them a reasonable opportunity to be here for the announcement of the verdict, and I've indicated to them that I will accept the verdict from you tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock.
The first inkling that they were moving along quickly came earlier today when the jurors asked the court to read back testimony from Alan Park. He is the limousine driver who took O.J. Simpson to the airport on the night of the murders. Because jurors are not provided with transcripts, the court reporter took the stand to read Park's testimony from March 28th.
I was looking for his house, so I was looking at addresses along the curb to find out which one was his, and that was the only spot there was an address. I saw them all the way down the street, so, question, okay, so you recalled that you saw that address? Answer, yes. Question, and you were looking at that curb? Answer, yes. And when you looked at the curb and you saw the address on that night as you drove over Brockingham, you indicated before that you did not see the white Bronco there? Answer, no. Did you see any cars parked along the curb to the north of the Rockingham gate? Answer, north of it? No.
Park was one of the prosecution's best witnesses, one who clearly had no bias in the case, one who checked his watch every few minutes that night. He also called his boss on his cell phone several times, concerned because Simpson did not appear to be home when he arrived to pick him up. And he's the witness who saw a 200-pound black person cross the driveway at about 10:52 p.m. and enter the front door. Right after that, said Park, lights went on inside, and Simpson finally answered the intercom, saying he'd overslept. In her closing argument, Marcia Clark highlighted that testimony, saying that person had to have been O.J. Simpson returning from the crime scene.
So there was no other way in, and that is why Alan Park saw the defendant walking in the door that night. And I'm going to tell you something, ladies and gentlemen, that was the defining moment of this trial. That was the one. Because when you understand that the defendant was out that night, when you understand that he lied to Alan Park about being asleep, when you understand that that Bronco was moved and that he was out in that Bronco that night, and that 10:03 call to Paula Barbieri is because he was out there making that phone call, then you understand how the defense falls apart. Then you understand where he was when his whereabouts are unaccounted for. And Alan Park's testimony is unrefuted. Alan Park came in and told us the truth, and he told it consistently. Bronco was not there, and neither was the defendant until 10:54.
After hearing the testimony read back, the jurors retired to the jury room. Less than 45 minutes later, they were back in court to tell the judge they'd reached a verdict.
He made this stunning announcement. There were literally gasps in the courtroom. It was so swift, and he said, I understand you've reached a verdict, is that correct? The forewoman said, yes, it is. And she was a little rattled because he said, well, where's the verdict forms? And she said, I left them in the jury room. So she had to be escorted back in to get the envelope and bring it back out for safekeeping overnight.
At the end of this very brief and startling session, the judge told the jurors to return to the hotel they've called home for almost 9 months and to pack up their things.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, then have your last pleasant evening, and we'll see you tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock.
The jury was pretty somber. They seemed relieved, however, when he said that they could go back to the hotel and pack up. A couple of them really smiled. It's the end of a long sequestration for them. They did not look at Simpson, which you can take any way you want to take. It's really not tea leaf reading time. We know there's a verdict. We don't know what it is. And hopefully everyone will be able to hang on till the morning and see what it is.
And so the jurors went back to their hotel, and a grim-looking O.J. Simpson went back to the county jail to begin what will surely be the longest night of his incarceration so far. But the police and sheriff's departments have plans to bolster their ranks tomorrow by adding more officers and deputies to the day shift. But even though the LAPD has opened an emergency operations center and has called for a modified tactical alert, no one seems to be expecting serious trouble. In the words of one police sergeant, "In all honesty, we've not received any information that would indicate that we should anticipate any large-scale problem." Ted?
Judy, is there any sense that the reason for holding things off until tomorrow, I realize a couple of the lead attorneys were out of town, was precisely to give the police a bit of a chance to get ready?
I think it's a combination of both, Ted. I think the attorneys, that is, have to get back. That's clear, and some of them were out of town. But I think it's also a chance to get the police, their tactical alert in place, the city ready for this. As you know, this has been something of an obsession out here in Los Angeles, not to mention across the country. And I imagine there'll be a lot of people who are staying home tomorrow to watch this. I imagine there'll be people taking long lunch hours in the east to watch this.
It's going to be happening at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, your time, 1 o'clock East Coast time.
Right.
Judy Muller, thanks very much. Joining us now from Los Angeles, Andrea Ford, a criminal court reporter for the Los Angeles Times, and Linda Deutsch, who covers criminal court cases for the Associated Press. Linda, let me begin with you. You said there was sort of everyone has used the same word, stunned, 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 stunned. So what happened in court? Describe it for me, would you?
What happened in court was actually quite low-key. The judge did not show any emotion. None of the lawyers showed any emotion. Even the jurors were pretty stony-faced. But the words were what carried the impact. When the judge said, "I understand you have a verdict," there were gasps, there were jaws dropping all over that courtroom. Everyone was absolutely startled because we had expected a much longer deliberation, certainly not just a few hours.
Why, Andrea, if indeed you agree with that, why was the expectation that it would take so long? Because now that people are beginning to rationalize it, they're saying, well, they had 9 months to go over it.
Well, you would think that just for appearance's sake, that's what I thought, that for appearance's sake they would be out for a couple of days, that they would, out of a sense of duty, go through all of those volumes of evidence, that they would spend some time with it. And you have to believe now that perhaps they were doing that all along.
Doing what all along?
Deliberating in some way in their own minds, and I don't mean by them talking, violating the judge's order and talking, but by sifting through this information all along.
And reaching a conclusion.
And perhaps so.
Okay. Andrea Ford, Linda Deutsch, if you'll be kind enough to stay with us. When we come back, we'll be joined by Simpson defense attorney Alan Dershowitz. That in a moment.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by Sharp Electronic Corporation.
Mr. Wagner, Marissa Thompson, how are you? I'm here in my office, and I just wanted to confirm our appointment this afternoon. You're off Route 15, right? The proposal? Sure, I have it right here. Absolutely, I'll fax it and we'll go over it. Jane, can you fax the sales proposal to Mr. Wagner? Sure. Oh, she is terrific. You'll have to meet her.
The Sharp Wizard, carried by the most organized people on Earth.
When was the last time you played in the rain? Let your hair go wild. Flex your muscles to the world. Stay.
Tomorrow, live at 12 Eastern, The Simpson Verdict, followed immediately by Barbara Walters' exclusive interview with Robert Shapiro, and later an ABC News special at 10, 9 Central.
It's the little things that let you know you...
Lead defense attorney Johnny Cochran returned to Los Angeles late tonight. He spoke briefly to reporters at the airport.
Well, you know, it's hard to figure, but I guess they'd heard enough, and they weren't out very long, and we'll find out tomorrow.
Are you concerned about the readback, Johnny, the fact that they asked for Mark, the limousine driver's testimony?
No, I'm not concerned about that.
What will you talk to OJ?
I'll talk to him tonight as soon as I get home. That just that we're looking for. No, we're just looking for it. He was there. We're looking forward to tomorrow, and looking forward to trying to get a verdict and getting this behind us, and that's what we're trying to do. You know.
You got that all today?
No, I've not. But Carl Douglas has.
Have you got any sense about how he's reacting going?
Well, he's looking forward. He's looking forward to this. Looking forward to putting this behind him, and hopefully he'll be home tomorrow night.
A lot of the experts have said that a quick verdict favors the prosecution.
Not necessarily. If you look in the papers from Sunday, all the experts said the verdicts, these jurors would be out for weeks. So nobody really knows. We'll have to wait until tomorrow.
Are you surprised that that's
I'm surprised. Yes, I am surprised somewhat. But this is I thought it'd be at least a week. But this jury has been a really good jury, and I'm satisfied it's in their hands, and I'm ready to see what they do tomorrow.
Joining us now from Watertown, Massachusetts, another Simpson defense attorney, Alan Dershowitz, and we are back again with Andrea Ford of the Los Angeles Times and Linda Deutsch of the Associated Press. Mr. Dershowitz, just before you and I came on, we were chatting very briefly, and you were saying you've been preparing the appeal for a year. You were kidding, right?
No, no. Of course, appellate lawyers are programmed to be pessimists. We always prepare for the worst-case scenario, and we have been filing briefs in this case for over a year, which would form the basis for an appeal if there were to be a conviction. And, of course, as an appellate lawyer, I'm always thinking that there's a possibility of a conviction. So tonight, I'm just outlining and thinking through what possible issues there might be if there were to be an appeal based on a conviction.
It's going to go one way or the other tomorrow morning. The one thing we now know is there isn't going to be a hung jury. If he is found not guilty, then all of this discussion is academic. So let's just for the moment assume if there is a finding of guilt, can you give us a sense of what some of the principal areas of appeal are going to be?
Sure. First of all, the search and seizure, the credibility of the police in climbing over the fence and saying that OJ Simpson wasn't a suspect at that time, the admission of 18 years of spousal discord, including a dream and a joke, the exclusion of much of the Furman tapes, the failure to give an instruction on his invocation of the Fifth Amendment, the allowing of Thano Paradas to testify in unsworn videotape. All of these are very significant issues that I think any appellate court would take very seriously. We're hoping, obviously.
The tendency, as you know, particularly in California appellate courts, over the past few years has been rarely to overturn judges for the judge's error in a case. Are you going after anything that Judge Ito has done or not done?
Well, obviously, all of these issues relate to judges' rulings.
Right.
The trend throughout the country is only about a 5% reversal rate in criminal appeals, but there are stronger cases. This is much stronger than a 5% case. Nobody can predict whether or not this case would be affirmed or reversed, but we have significant issues. We hope we won't have to reach them. We hope the tea leaf readers who predict a conviction are wrong, but I'm not prepared to speculate, and I have to be ready for any possible eventuality.
What grounds would there be, if any, in the fact that the jury only took 3 hours to consider?
We'd probably have to learn a lot more about what went on in the jury room, and in fact, courts are quite reluctant to get behind jury deliberations and to second-guess how the deliberations went. But if we found out that, in fact, the jury hypothetically had made up its mind before the closing arguments or during the course of the testimony, that could be a basis for appeal. But that's a very, at this point, on the basis of what we know, just the haste of reaching a verdict is not a very promising avenue for appellate review.
Just give me your sense as an attorney of many years standing, before you know the verdict now, how you feel, though, about a jury in a case that has been dragging on now for the better part of a year, and one in which they have been involved for over 9 months, in resolving it in just 3 hours.
Well, I think it's a source of concern. I think everybody would have been happier, whichever side you're on, and people obviously have taken sides on this case, if the jury had asked for a lot of the evidence, if it had spent a few days at least going over everything, and then come back and said, look, we've evaluated all the evidence and all the testimony, and this is our verdict. I think people who are opposed to the verdict will have an appearance of injustice issue to focus on in what they will claim will be a rush to judgment. We just don't know enough to know whether that's valid or not, and perhaps in days to come we'll find out. We'll also find out how the jury feels when it learns how much evidence was kept from it, particularly the Furman tapes. We may have a jury that says, gee, we were pretty satisfied one way, but now that we know what was kept from us, we have grave second thoughts. So there's going to be, this case is far from over.
Andrea Ford, Linda Deutsch, the two of you have been covering this case throughout. Anything that either one of you would like to address to Mr. Dershowitz? Linda?
I wonder whether you feel that the Furman issue, now that we know that there's such a great rush to get this verdict out, whether the Furman issue was as important as all of us said it was.
Well, it may very well be that the jury will end up telling us they believe Furman was telling the truth about the N-word, that all they learned about is that he used it 2 times. They never heard anything about this business about killing African Americans and burning them. And what was Johnny arguing about? We didn't believe Kathleen Bell, they may tell us. It may turn out the judge was just dead wrong when he said that it would be overkill to give them more of the tapes and that really it would be more prejudicial than probative. It may turn out that it was really important for the jury to hear much more about the Furman tapes so that they could then judge the credibility of the witnesses. Otherwise, it's still a cop's word against 3 Good Samaritan's words, and we know that jurors often believe policemen, particularly when they don't hear the full extent of what the policeman may have said on the tape.
Tell you what, let's take a short break. When we come back, Andrea Ford, let's pose your question to Alan Dershowitz, and I'll have a couple of my own. Back with Alan Dershowitz in a moment.
Boris will be just where you parked it.
And we're back again with Alan Dershowitz and the question from Andrea Ford, who's been covering the trial for the LA Times. Andrea?
Yes, I'd like to know why, Mr. Dershowitz, you feel that you might successfully challenge Judge Ito's decision not to tell the jury anything about Mark Furman when it seemed pretty clear in the law that this was not permissible.
No, it's not clear in the law. There is a California statute that says that the invocation of the Fifth Amendment should not be disclosed to the jury, but there's a United States Supreme Court case that says that when a non-defendant invokes the Fifth Amendment, it's perfectly relevant for the jury to assess, either in civil cases or when the non-defendant is a witness in a criminal case. So we have a conflict between federal constitutional law and the practice in California, and the better practice all over the United States is to advise juries when a policeman who has testified fully and incriminatingly then selectively invokes the Fifth. He may have waived the Fifth Amendment privilege. It's a very significant issue, and I think academics and commentators all over the country understand that it's a serious issue. That doesn't mean that I'm predicting or anybody could predict how an appellate court would eventually decide it, but that's an issue that could eventually find its way to the United States Supreme Court or to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals.
You've been studying the case closely. What does this case tell you about the validity of long trials like this?
Well, trials should be shorter. I think jurors should not be sequestered for this length of time. California generally takes much too much time in trying cases. I think lots of judges are now trying to experiment with systems where they call both sides in and they say, look, we're going to give you 90 days, put on your best case. We're going to give you 45 days. It's hard to do in a criminal case, but I think that one of the lessons we've learned is that we can shorten trials considerably, and that judges do have an enormous amount of discretion in how they shorten the case. What happened in this case that upset the defense, of course, is that the judge was very permissive in the beginning of the case when the prosecution put on its case, and then became very concerned about time toward the end when the defense was trying to put on its case.
Well, I mean, you can hardly argue that this judge was particularly concerned about time, given how long it all went. I mean, toward the end, I think he leaned over backwards for everyone, didn't he?
Well, I think he tried to be a little tough in the end when he, for example, restricted the extent of the Furman tapes coming in and restricted some other testimony, for example, challenging one of the government's witnesses, FBI witnesses, by reference to how he may have messed up with evidence in other cases, a ruling which he had made the opposite way earlier on in the case. So these are issues that we will have to look at, whoever is going to be ultimately responsible for preparing any appellate brief. And again, we're speculating there. We may all find tomorrow that this case is over for good because there's been an acquittal, but as an appellate lawyer, one always has to take the worst case scenario.
Let me just ask you to make the point. I think most people already understand this, but there is only one way in which there is an appeal, and that is if the defendant is found guilty. If he's found not guilty, that's the end. The prosecution can't come back with anything.
But if there is a conviction and we appeal, say, and win in the California Intermediate Court of Appeals, then the state can appeal it to the state Supreme Court. So the state can appeal, but only if we win the first appeal. They can't appeal if there's an acquittal.
And while such an appeals process is in train, Mr. Simpson would remain in prison?
In practice, that's the most likely scenario, of course. In theory, there is bail pending appeal, but not traditionally in cases of this kind.
All right. I thank you all very much indeed. When we come back, we'll be joined by two people whose job it is to figure out what moves a jury.